The city reacted in a very encouraging way. It was a devastating week for Charleston. And I think people reacted to that devastation by coming together, thankfully, not by doing anything else of a negative sense. You've had a week of anger, a week of frustration, a week of hope since they swiftly arrested the perpetrator. It's been a week, I think, of sharing. A lot of people had to come face to face with some things about race in South Carolina and in America that were made more stark by this incident. So it's been an interesting week at best.
Um, we had talked a little bit about, the way the city has reacted as citizens. How is it different, and maybe why is it different than some of the other reactions that we've seen in the past months in different cities?
Well, I think Charleston, North Charleston reactions to this and to the Walter Scott shooting were different for a couple of reasons. One of those was that the nature of things just kind of rolled out in a way that it had to be different. In the case of the Scott incident, you had an indisputable video of someone being shot in the back by a policeman and fairly rapid charging of that. So that helped. In this case, you had an immediate heavy response by law enforcement and an arrest in less than 24 hours. I think that helped. I think that Charleston is accustomed to accommodating to difficulty when Charleston needs to. And I think that you've got elected officials who might not be as isolated from the people as they are in some places. So all of that helps, I think. That there's a network of folks who can talk. And so I think South Carolina is calm as long as things go like that, as long as things move swiftly and it's clear that action is going to be taken.
Maybe talk a little bit about the role of faith and the church in the response. There have been numerous vigils outside the church. How has the city responded in that way?
Well, it's responded in a wonderful way. The churches of Charleston have come together. You know, when the incident happened on Wednesday night, and I went down there, I saw Coastal Crisis Chaplaincy, which is a local response agency, and they were stunned that there were already about 25 AME clergy on site as well to deal with that kind of thing. I think that it's been good for those who thought the AME Church might be a little rinky-dink storefront operation to find out that it is a well-organized institutional body of faith. I think that was a lesson from that. I think that because there are some churches that work together in the Charleston area justice ministry, which brings together a diverse group of clergy, then you had the linkages so that those churches started to offer to respond, offer to help, offer their facilities, food or whatever might be needed almost immediately.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned from this. What have you learned?
Well, I think we've learned on the one hand that if you're going to try to exterminate the church and start a race war, that's an exceedingly bad idea, that people will respond by coming together rather than going into conflict. I think that people have learned that forgiveness actually is a Christian virtue, not forgetting and not saying there should be no retribution, but practicing the forgiveness that Christians are supposed to practice is a piece of that. I think one of the byproducts that is ironic is that the Confederate flag just might be coming off the State House grounds because no one could deny the optics of what happened, the circumstances of what happened. I hope it serves as a cautionary tale, and my sense is that it might be serving as a cautionary tale for those who like to, what would you call it? A cautionary tale for those who use race to stir up voters, those who would appeal to the fears of those who move by racial fear, to understand that if you do that, then you might get some folks out to the polls, but then again, you might get somebody who's less stable out to a gun shop, and the results can be tragic.
Let's talk about forgiveness at the court hearing. Every single one of those family members forgave him. That's just amazing. Talk about forgiveness in this situation.
Well, the forgiveness is supposed to be a mandate for all Christians. Our belief is that our Savior forgave those who murdered him, and that we are to follow suit. that gets lost sometimes in some of the what passes for Christian rhetoric these days, the warfare rhetoric, the vengeance rhetoric. But that lies at the heart of authentic Christianity. I think it's also hardwired into the historically black church, particularly in the American South. You've got a church whose founders in the antebellum days came to Christ at a time when they could be beaten, whipped, raped, sold, murdered, maimed, and knew that they did not have any legal recourse, that they had very little power to deal with that, and that they had to look at these people who did that every day, work for them like animals with no pay. How do you cope with that? You either just go off your rocker with stress, or you learn to forgive and gather yourself and do what needs to be done. I think that's a piece of what shapes that forgiveness.
What's the significance of the location that the shooting happened at, do you think?
It's a frightening location to think that someone would have the nerve to do that in the house of the Lord. And it's to do that for racial reasons particularly. You know, I've heard a couple of folk argue that this was an attack on religious liberty. That's a bunch of hooey. If he wanted to go shoot up a church and some church folks, if he got off I-26 as folks normally would coming into Charleston, he would pass 7 churches and turn by Sentinel Square Baptist Church to get to Emmanuel. So it was very obvious racial intent. It's as old as the Birmingham bombings. It's as old as the church burnings in the late 90s. People understand that the historically black church is an institution of power, is an institution of influence. And when there's a need to strike out at what they think is an effort for progress in the African American community, very often the church is the object of that. You know, it's sad, but it's a reality that we all live with. Back in the early thousands, when this was all hot, the Confederate flag thing, James Gallman was a state NAACP president. Lonnie Randolph, who's now president, was first vice president. I was second vice president. And we said, not jokingly, but kind of in black humor, you know, the flag would probably come down if one of us gets killed. And none of the 3 of us got killed, but Clemente did.
Moving forward, how do you move forward and heal from this?
Well, what I think you have to do, what I said at a visual that I spoke for a couple of days ago, is that you build upon what we've done already. There's been an amazing coming together of people. There has been an amazing outpouring of love and compassion, an amazing level of new understanding and new willingness to work together. And my hope would be that all of that is not lost when the funerals are done, when everybody's gone home, when the news cycle has moved on. This is a time when across our state, houses of faith, perhaps even chambers of commerce, and folks in the nonprofit and governmental sectors need to be looking at points of possible contact and collaboration, ways to keep the conversation going, ways to know each other better. I think if we do that, then that'll be a fitting testament to those 9 folks.
And what do you think it will take to change racism, eliminate racism in our state or in the country?
An act of God. Other than that, racism is American as apple pie. It's ingrained into our system. You know, if you build your nation with slavery built in, then there are 2 things of necessity you have to deal with. The first of those is, how do you justify people owning people and call yourself a Christian? You justify that by saying these people are not people like we are. They're inferior, and actually we're helping them by taking them out of their savage existence and giving them life in America. Second problem is that the planter class was a minority class in the white community. You had a much larger class that was dirt poor. How do you keep that dirt poor class from finding affinity with those slaves? You tell that dirt poor class, these people are not like you, and what's more, they're dangerous. They want your women, they might kill you, they'll take your property, so you better watch them and make sure that if they try to get to you, you get to them first. That's the heart of American racism, and that's going to be very hard to eradicate. You know, it's like roaches. You can do a lot to exterminate them, but there's always one that survives.
And you think that has just grown over the years?
Yeah, I think it's grown over the years. I think it's been exacerbated since President Obama was elected, because it brought out a lot of people who were in the closet when it came to expressing their bigotry. And there was such a wave of bigoted stuff that flew out immediately that I think it gave some folks license to pull this stuff out of the closet, dust it off, and throw it around again. Some of it, I think, now probably go back in the closet.
Do you think it'll come back out now with the Confederate flag maybe coming down?
I don't think so. My barometer for stuff like that, interestingly, is the online comment section to newspapers. And you can tell the temperature of things by how many off-the-wall, ignorant, rude, anonymous statements follow any story about race. And I've looked at the papers this week, and there's been an amazing shortage of that stuff. Most of the stuff has been compassionate, conciliatory, encouraging. It means that for this week at least, that kind of trash has been unacceptable. My hope is that it'll be unacceptable for the long term.
And what do you want to see for Charleston in the future?
For Charleston and America, I want it to be, there should be more equity. There should be more togetherness. It should be a time when discussions like this are obsolete because you won't have the issues of race. I think that for Charleston, it means acknowledging that we never really ended the Civil War. You know, it's been 150 years ceasefire, but war has been going on. I think that hopefully this will mark the end of the Civil War. This will mark the time when people really do get beyond some of the baggage, when there is equity and fairness in the economic sector, in the education of our young people, in health, in housing, rolling back gentrification, making sure that law enforcement actually is fair across the board. All of those things, you know, those things happen. Charleston and America will be better places.
Do you think they'll ever happen?
To a degree, I think it will. It's not going to happen all the way because it never has. You will get surges of goodwill and you will get surges of ill will. And I would hope that the surges of goodwill will be longer.
Okay. Good. Anything else you want to add on those topics that we covered before we move on? You think you're good?
Good.
All
Yeah.
right. Now I'm just going to ask a couple of questions for
Okay.
our other reporter. You knew Senator, how do you pronounce his last name? Just so
Pinckney.
Pinckney. Okay.
Yeah.
I've heard it pronounced like a million different ways. You knew him. How would you describe him?
Best way I described him is the way I described him to somebody the other day. If I had daughters, he's the kind of guy I'd want them to marry. I have known Clemente really literally since he was a teenager coming up in the AME Church's youth department. I saw him develop, always had maturity and bearing beyond his years. He grew into a very effective pastor who went to an old church, and old churches can be cantankerous and museumy, and he had them moving in a positive direction. He made some wonderful changes in the counties covered by his Senate district, especially like Jasper, Colleton, Hampton, counties that have economic struggles. He was poising them to do better economically and educationally. Very easygoing. He was relentless but easygoing. If he was determined to make a positive change, he would do it, but he would do it in such a way that people would be changing without even knowing they were changing. He had that kind of gift, and he will be sorely missed.
And what do you think is his legacy that he's leaving behind?
That you can be Christian, that you can work for reconciliation, that you can be positive but also effective, and that battles do not necessarily have to be won on the battlefield. The battles are won when you change hearts, and he changed a lot of them in his day.
And what are you going to miss the most about him?
Phone calls, because, you know, we were kindred spirits. He looked at me as a little bit of a mentor, I think. And so, you know, he would get with me on church gossip, church administration, stuff like that. We would shoot the breeze about church happenings. We would talk about the district because my presiding elder district covers his Senate district, basically. So we would talk about that, talk political strategy and insights. So I miss the conversation.
Have you spoken with his family at all?
I spoke with them briefly. You know, they are very understandably devastated, so they have been limiting phone calls greatly. I think after the services, that'll probably get better. But they are coping as best they can.
Have you talked to any of the other victims' families?
I talked with Dan Simmons' family. Dan and I were seminary classmates, pastored together in Columbia, pastored together down here in the Charleston area. He was in Mount Pleasant for a bit, in Hollywood for a bit. So yeah, we've always been friends. So I talk with Ann, his wife.
Now, I know you said that, as a Christian, it's, God's commanded you to forgive.
Mm-hmm.
How do you actually go about doing that?
You appreciate the fact that we're all creations of God, and that you don't quantify sin. Murder is a sin. Lying is a sin. Jealousy and stoking racial insecurity are sinful. You look at your own sins, you forgive the sins of others, and you do that with an understanding that forgiveness does not mean everything is okay. It doesn't mean that if you have done something heinous, as in this case, that you should not suffer for it. You should still suffer for it. You should pay whatever consequence is meted out by the legal system in this world. You should hopefully have a little talk with the Lord before you get to the next world and set yourself right before there's whatever judgment the Lord decides to give. But that you don't carry around that weight of saying, I cannot forgive you. That's a part of the healing process. And it's interesting that there are so many people who trumpet their Christianity, and they wrap their Christianity not in forgiveness but in vengeance. I didn't go to the Response South Carolina rally, but if it's like ones I've had colleagues in Houston and New Orleans talk about, there's a lot of us versus them rhetoric. There's a lot of rhetoric that strongly suggests that God belongs to one political party. And that's not real Christianity. That's the kind of stuff that Christ criticized, and it got him killed, just like Clemente.